Our next presenter is Conrad Lavallee, a northern neighbor from Canada, and we are delighted to welcome him to the symposium. The title of Conrad's presentation is The Fractal Nature of the Urantia Book's Foundational Concepts. Conrad, the platform is yours.
Thank you very much, and hi, everyone. The foundational concept of Urantia Book follow a definite pattern of relationships, and they involve a twofold aspect of evolution. Okay, this pattern is similar to a mathematical pattern, and this mathematical pattern, which is very simple, is still sort of virtually ignored, and it is foundational to the world of numbers, and it is a pattern that behaves like a fractal. It also shares some interesting points with the Julia fractal, and by extension to the Mandelbrot fractal. So to begin with, what do we mean when we talk about the foundational concepts? Well, they're related to the nature, nothing less than the nature of reality, and the genesis, the institution of reality. So among those concepts, you have the I am, or the Father Infinite. And about reality, you have different flavors of reality: deified, interassociated, non-deified, actual, emergent, potential, existential, experiential. And there's different levels, like finite level of supremacy, the epsonate level, which is midway between a kind of buffer zone between the finite and the absolute. And you have the notion of archetypes. So how does that relate to the concept of evolution? And what are those relationships between those concepts that do share a similarity with a mathematical pattern? So there's an axis that is associated with what we call the evolution of dominance, and we mean spiritual dominance. That's a subdivision of reality into those three parts. So the deified, interassociated, and undeified. You could, for instance, associate deified with upper paradise, and undeified with lower paradise, and interassociated reality with Havona and the seven super universes and the master universe. Deified could be associated with spiritual realities, undeified with energy matter, interassociated with mind and Urantia, if you want. Okay, and you have here some references pointing to those concepts in the Urantia Book. The deified level can be associated to the field of spirituality, level of spirituality, or the field of values. Interassociated, mind Urantia, or to the field of meanings and the phenomenal universe as we know it and perceive it. And finally, non-deified, well, can associate it to facts or energy matter. Now, there's another axis that is important. We'll get to it in a few moments. But to sum up what we call the axis of the evolution of dominance, to sum it up fairly quickly, we could say spirit over mind and mind over matter. And you have passages within the Urantia Book that do substantiate those statements. Okay. The axis of emergence. This is more related to the concept of cosmic evolution. Okay. You have the actual level of reality, the potential level of reality. And in between, we would consider the level of emergent reality, or that would be the field of cosmic evolution. So you can imagine that potentials are gradually emerging to become actual. and some passages. So what you'll notice here is that this actual is related to the triodity of actuality, and this potential side would be related to the triodity of potentiality. And in between the emergence, you have the emergence of the supreme being, God the ultimate, and the unrevealed consummator of universal reality at an absolute level. Now, from the viewpoint of space and time, there's a passage indicating that, okay, reality is further divisible also as existential and experiential, okay, and personal and impersonal. Now, personal reality would be associated to the deified. Impersonal reality may be associated to the energy matter, or the undeified part. As to existential and experiential, the existentials are associated with the actual and the potential absolutes. Experiential, well, the supreme, God the ultimate, the evolutionary deity, so to speak. Now let us take a look about how the Urantia book talks about the institution of reality. And we'll begin to see the relationship building up between those concepts. So, first, the I am separates reality between the deified and the undeified. That's the first manifestation, so to speak. So that's the institution of reality. It doesn't take place in time. This is an ontological relationship. That's a pure being, and these are relationship to the pure being. It's eternal, but it's a process. Stem from the I am, and then you have this division, a divergence between the deified and the undeified. And this creates a tension, which is resolved by the universal absolute. So we're on the potential side here of things, but notice that you have a divergence which is resolved by a midterm, a divergence between two terms resolved by a midterm. Now, while this transaction takes place, on the actual side, the I am becomes the universal father of the eternal Son, simultaneously becoming the source of the Isle of Paradise. So eternally, you have also this divergence between the Son and the Isle of Paradise. Son is strictly, purely spiritual. This is purely related to undeified reality. And of course, in the presence of the Isle of Paradise and the eternal Son, well, the infinite spirit appears together with the central universe, central and eternal universe of Habona. And we know from many texts in the Urantia book that mind, the cosmic mind, the infinite mind of the infinite spirit bridges the gap or resolves the tension between the pure spirituality of the eternal Son and the undeified nature of the Isle of Paradise. So if I go to the completed diagram, you notice here that you have two continuums resolved by a middle term, both on the potential side of things and on the actual side of things. And this is interesting. That's a pattern of relationship at the origin of everything. has a, and we'll examine the nature of those talked about the twofold concept of evolution, spiritual dominance. You have three layers: deified, as we saw, interassociated, and non-deified, which is akin from an experiential perspective to the spiritual level, energy matter level, and the mental. Or if you put that in terms of a practice, the level of values, facts, and meanings, integrating both values and facts. And you have the Supreme, God the Supreme Being, and the Almighty Supreme, if you want to extend that to the concept of supremacy. Okay. If you look at the other axis, actualization of potential through experiential emergence, or the source of cosmic evolution. Okay. Existential, experiential, and experiential. So the three absolute of actuality and those of potentiality. And in the middle, you have experiential emergence, supreme, ultimate, absolute. Supreme evolution and time and space, absolute. It's timeless and spaceless, but the ultimate seems to transcend time and space without being absolute. Okay. Now, as to the process of evolution, also referred to as emergence in the Urantia Book, it's a reinforcing dynamics or loops between actual and potentials via their emerging middle point. If you look at it from that perspective, there's a tension between actual and potential. The midpoint is emergent, deity. And that's where the tension between actual and potential seems to be resolved. And it's an evolution, if you look at it from that perspective, would be an iterative process. I'll continue on because you have the other aspects of evolution, spiritual dominance. And here you have, okay, the same kind of loop between spirit and matter resolved by mind, but this time with a direction of dominance. So evolution implies that spirit will gradually control mind, which will in turn control matter. Okay. Now, how could those loops or dynamics work from an evolutionary perspective? We can say that an actual reality configuration solicits or triggers new realizable potentials. Those potentials are processed in time in a variety of ways to become increasingly actual. And I'm thinking about it here from a time-space perspective. When fully actualized, they enrich the reality configuration from which they were triggered, which will, in turn, unleash or trigger a new and higher set of potentials. And the cycle repeats itself. So we're dealing here with an iterative process. It's always moving in that direction. So there's a reality configuration. It triggers some potential, which is gradually emerging here at the middle point. And when you have a new and more developed configuration on the actual side, it is receptive to new potentials. And you have that loop that continually moves. And you can consider that as a form of evolution taking place at the spiritual level, at the mental level or Urantia level, or at the physical level. Okay. So how could we, is there a mathematical relationship that we can consider as a parallel to those relationship in the Urantia book? Well, if we posit here that two numbers represent opposite or complemental factors and uncontinuous between them, that's an analogy. But if we take that as a principle, okay, the average between two numbers being the point that unifies or resolves the tensions between those two numbers, and put that as a repeating cycle, then we can find quite easily some mathematical patterns that will match what we have in the Urantia book. Okay. So in this process, though, I used a certain number of approaches, but the most important one is what we call contemplative thinking. So it consists of putting oneself in a mindful state of spiritual and creative awareness in which we look at things with new eyes, as if we were seeing them for the first time. Contemplating figures and configurations allows new patterns to emerge gradually or to pop up while in a state of calm, relaxed, yet receptive mindfulness. And such contemplative approaches work particularly well to unleash the formidable capabilities of visual thinking. I'll skip those parts here. And almost spatial thinking. It consists here of holding different perspectives in the same mental space. Okay. This is coming from The Emerging Goddess, a book written by Albert Rothenberg, The Creative Process in Art, Science, and Other Fields. Merging Conceptual Planes from Arthur Koestler in The Act of Creation, and Januszian thinking, which consists of looking at two opposite directions at the same time. A bit like thesis, antithesis, and synthesis in the dialectical approaches. So we have two axes here, the evolutionary one, evolution of spiritual dominance. If we put it horizontally in rows, and the axis of evolutionary emergence, you have a 3x3 matrix, which I call, for the purpose of this presentation, the ontological matrix. And it reveals fascinating synergy between the relationships of those two axes. The creative juxtaposition of those two axes form the ontological matrix mandala. Okay, there's 8 axes in this mandala where tensions between their divergent parts are resolved by their complementary or middle elements. So here's the pattern, set of patterns. So you have actual emergent potential here, deified, interassociated, and undeified. And of course, this middle level unifies the two external one from a column-wise, and from a row-wise perspective, the middle section unifies the other two sections. And you see that existential, actual existentials, and potential existentials are resolved by emergent experiential. And if you look at deified actual and deified potential, it is unified here, or the tension between those two is resolved by deified emergence. You can do the same on each row and each column. So the arrows here indicate the direction of those relationships, and it highlights the pattern of relationships that we can see among some of the foundational concepts of the Urantia book. Okay, well, you probably saw that only a poet can discern poetry in the commonplace prose of routine existence. So I say I bring this quotation here because what you'll see is extraordinarily prosaic. I tend to say more prosaic than that you die. Here's two very familiar example of that pattern. A mere keyboard on your calculator or on your phone or your calculator. Okay. After this presentation, you'll never look at those keyboards the exact same way again. With new eyes. So here's the basic mathematical pattern at play between the foundational concepts, similar to what you see in the Urantia book. Now look at this. You've seen that during your whole life. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in the 3x3 matrix. Subconsciously, you know where those relationships falls. We'll bring that to the field of consciousness. So what do we have here? We have a center to begin with. Okay, 5 being the center of that little matrix. Periphery. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 6. Oh, bar. Now, 5 averages its surrounding numbers. Okay, so 1 plus 2, 3, 4. The maths are very simple here. A toddler could understand those, but the principle is important. So if you add them together, divide by 8, of course, you get 5 in the center. So far, so good. There's 4 diagonals in this structure. And you'll notice that 5 is the average of 1 and 9. It's also the average of 2 and 8. It averages 3 and 7. And it averages 6 and 4. So if we keep the analogy, we could say that 5 resolves the tension between 1 and 9, 2 and 8, 3 and 7, 6 and 4. So what we have here is a center unifying, being the average value, every elements of its periphery. I think you begin to see where I'm getting from here. We also have 4 sides. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Now we notice that the center of each side averages its extremities. For instance, okay, 2 is the average of 1 and 3. 3, 6, the average of 6 and 9. Okay. 8, the average of 7 and 9. And 4, of course, the average of 1 and 7. Okay. We have 3 rows. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We can read them the other way around if we want to. So we notice here that 556 is the average, okay, of 123 plus 789. Add those 2 numbers, divide by 2, you get 456. And of course, it works the other way around. Okay. But the important point here is that the 2 external rows are unified by the internal row. And we have 3 columns. So 1, 4, 7, 2, 5, 8, 3, 6, 9. And we also notice that 258 is the average of 147 and 369. Or you could say that 852 is the average of 741 and 963. I could go further, because if you do the maths diagonally, those relationships are still holding. Those average are still all holding. So we have an intriguing mathematical properties here. if you consider the sides, the average of sides and their middle terms, of diagonals and their midterms, of columns and the central columns, and the row and the middle row, together with the center, averaging all its peripheral elements. Okay. So the simple matrix presents a pattern of relationship, which is strikingly similar to the Mandelic structure of the ontological matrix that I just showed a few moments ago, with 8 polar mathematical tensions. So this is a set of relationship that runs parallel to the relationship among the foundational concepts of the Urantia book. And for the sake of simplicity and this presentation, I will refer to this set of mathematical relationship as the foundational relationships. So by foundational relationships, I will refer to those relationships as taken from the Urantia book or as taken from that simple number pad. So we come back to the ontological pattern, and you can see that the parallel is strikingly different from here. Now, and that's another representation. I overlaid that on a mandala. And all those mandalas that you see throughout these presentations are representation of that same set of foundational relationships. Okay. The IM occupies the center here, and I would like to draw your attention to these passages. At some point, infinitely distant, hypothetical, past eternity moment, the I am may be conceived as both thing and no thing, and otherwise both deified and undeified, as both cause and effect, as both volition and response. At this hypothetical eternity moment, there is no differentiation throughout all infinity. Infinity is filled with the infinite encompasses infinity. This is the hypothetical static moment of eternity. Actuals are still contained within their potentials, and potentials have not yet appeared within the infinity of the I am. Okay. However, even in this conjectured situation, we must assume the existence of the possibility of self-will. And at the bottom here, you simply say that when you stand in awe of the magnitude of the master universe, pause to consider that even this inconceivable creation can be no more than a partial revelation of the infinite. And the universe of universes, with its host of inhabited personalities, a vast and complex organism, but the first source and center is infinitely more complex than the universe and personalities which have become real in response to it is willful mandates. So let us overlay the mathematical pattern here. So you can do the math. It's fairly evident. This is homospatial thinking, okay? Mathematical pattern with some of the foundational concepts taken from the Urantia book, but we'll go a little bit further. Let's position additional concepts taken from the Urantia book. And I'll skip the text here just to comment on those. The eternal sun. Eternal sun is an actual and deified absolute. It can only go on position 1. The Isle of Paradise, being an undeified yet actual absolute, can only go on position 7. Deity absolute, being potential and deified, can only go on position 3. The unqualified absolute, being, of course, undeified, yet potential as an absolute, can only go on position 9. Okay, and the infinite spirit, with the infinite mind of the spirit, which makes the link between the eternal sun and the Isle of Paradise, and the universe of Avona, being can only go position 4. as to the universal absolute, well, they're related to interassociated reality, and this is related to deified reality. This is related to undeified, of course. And you can see that those relationships are still holding and are still valid. Now, when you read the whole Urantia book and keep those patterns in mind throughout the reading, you will notice that those patterns are reinforced continually throughout the text of the Urantia book. Representation of those patterns now. And here you have the Havona universe on the interassociated level with the infinite spirit. Okay. And another representation with the maths and so forth. Okay, so I'm a bit looping here, so I'll go. So you have what I call a Mandalic framework. By mandala, we mean a circle and a center with relationships between them. Now, the set of relationships involved in this framework form a conceptual pattern, a template of some sort, from which the foundational concepts taken from the Urantia revelation represents an instance, even though, in my case, they inspired this whole concept. From the same Mandalic framework, we can produce different sets of relevant or consistent instances. So here you have the same set of patterns that I could use, the same set of foundational relationships that I use as a template. And from this template, I can develop all sorts of approaches, methodologies, all sorts of systems from that single template. Okay. Inspired by the teachings of the Urantia book. And if you look at the relationships with the genesis of reality, if I come back to this point, well, those numbers do match perfectly well. And in the middle here, you have experiential reality. Okay. So there's a lot of fascinating implications here from all sorts of perspectives, from philosophically, from an ontological perspective, resolving, for instance, the problems and issue regarding the relationship of the one and the many, of the oneness of God and the diversity of phenomenal reality, from the perspective of an integral practice, from an epistemological perspective. There's a lot of, if you look at this pattern from different perspectives, but it boils down to something like this. We have a pattern of multidimensional and synergistically functional complementarities. Now, I wanted to demonstrate here that this pattern is, from the mathematical standpoint, works like a kind of archetype, and it has a fractal nature. For this pattern, very simple, to behave like a fractal, you must be able to replicate it with different sets of numbers. So that's what I'm attempting to do here. First, my first trial was to double the digits. So if I come back to the pattern here, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I simply double the digit, perform the maths, and the whole set of foundational relationships are still holding. Okay. Now, it works whether you double the digit, triple the digits, or quadruple the digits, it will always work. Next, wanted to see, what if I take a number at random, any number? And here for the sake of this presentation, I'm taking 54. And I append 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 at the end. You do the maths, and the whole set of foundational relationships are still holding, which is quite interesting. I will try something else. Rather than appending a number at the end of those, of 54, I'll put the number before. I'll prefix those numbers, 154, 254, 354, and so forth. Again, the whole set of functional relationships hold. Still even more interesting. Now, what if we put a number in between? So 514, 524, 534, and 44, and so forth. Again, the whole set of functional relationships are still holding. So yes, you can replicate this pattern indefinitely. It's not sufficient. The demonstration doesn't go deep enough, at least not to my taste. But I noticed, though, that the first 9 digits of the decimal system are common to all those examples that we just seen. But there seems to be something very special about those first 9 digits. And that's what we're getting at. They're archetypal values in the number system. Here what we say, each rational number shares one and only one of those 9 digits as an archetype. In other words, each number, however large or small, whether positive or negative, shares one of the 9 digits of the decimal system as its essence, as long, of course, as we're dealing with the decimal system. And for convenience, I'll refer to those archetypal values as their sigma value. So how do you get the sigma value of a number? Let us take a number randomly, 1,945,874. To get its sigma value, you add its digits. So 1,945,874, 38. If the result has more than 1 digit, you repeat the process until you end up with a single digit. So 3 plus 8, 11, 1 plus 1, 2. So sigma value of 1,945,874 is 2. Now those sigma values reveal some fascinating mathematical patterns, which will play a significant part, by the way, in the following demonstration. Now I want to repeat I want to focus on the repeating and multi-dimensional and multi-directional nature of that pattern. So what I did here, I'll enlarge the first part of this graph a bit. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9, well, you repeat the cycle. So that's the 0 component. From 9, you go to 10, 11, 12, 13, and here you get 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, 20, 21. You see how you get the idea. There's a lot of interesting and fascinating aspects associated with this very, very simple diagram. Let me highlight some of those. And you need to look at these numbers with a contemplative eye. First, I connected each layer, each level with lines for the sake of clarity. And the first thing that I notice, the foundational relationships hold at each level. They repeat themselves. That's interesting. Next thing that I noticed, well, you have numbers radiating from number 1. And if you look at the sigma values of all those numbers, they share the same sigma value based on 1. 1, 0 is 1, 1, 9 is 10, so it's 1, 0, 2. So all the sigma values here are equal to 1. Here, all the sigma values are equal to 2, and 3, and 6, and 4, and 5, all those numbers at the center have a sigma value of 5. Okay. Let us suppose you have a finite set here because it goes from 1 to 99. But theoretically, you could extend the whole set of numbers with a sigma value of 1 infinitely. And the relationships work with negative numbers as well. So on both the positive and negative side, you could have an unlimited set, which becomes what we call a transfinite number. It is more than finite, but less than absolute. More than finite, less than absolute, because it doesn't contain the sigma numbers with a sigma value of 2 or 3 or 4 or 4 and 5 and 6, 7. So, but you have transfinite numbers. And in Cantor's theory, those transfinite numbers would be quantitatively equal. And I won't go why, because that would be beyond the scope of that presentation. But the interesting point, even with transfinite numbers, and here you're dealing with the mathematical equivalent of what we call an absolute reality, but only on the quantitative side of things. But the mathematical equivalent of an absolute reality here. And the interesting thing is that the foundational relationships are still holding even when you're dealing with transfinite numbers. And that has a lot of implications from a philosophical standpoint. So it would be easy to convert that into formulas, but here you notice that there's only a difference of 1 horizontally, of 3 vertically, and each layer is separated by 9 values. Another interesting observation. If you look at each line, what I realized is that if you add the numbers, the bracketed numbers, let us say 10, 19, 28, put that on the first row of a 3 by 3 matrix, then 37, 46, 55, second row, 64, 73, 82, third row, and you do the maths, you'll notice that the foundational relationships are still holding. Same thing with the red bracket, same thing with the green bracket. I mean, and it works for all of those radial lines. So there's zillion ways to come up with a 3 by 3 matrix with different figures holding those foundational relationships. And they also work between different levels. For instance, if you take the numbers in A here and C, add them together, divide them by 2, you'll get the numbers in B. And you notice that they are spanning different levels within that grade. And I have different examples, numbers in green and red and so forth, which I do represent in a variety of ways. I'm passing very quickly through those diagrams. Again, I'm saying that these foundational relationships are foundational to the world of numbers. And I'm gradually getting to that point. Here I would like you to just notice some interesting point. There's 2 horizontal lines and 2 vertical lines. The horizontal lines will pass through number 11 and number 44. Vertical lines are passing through number 22 and number 33. That's an interesting observation. Another very interesting observation here. there's a set of a set of inverting numbers. Well, here in the world of numbers, you'll see that around 55, you have 6, 4, 4, 6, 8, 2, 7, 3, 3, 7, 8, 2, 2, 8, 9, 1, 1, 9. So you have sets of repeating numbers across the board. And the number with identical digits are particularly interesting. So you have 55 here. Here you have 11. Here you have 66. I think it's 22, 33, 44. And 88, 99, and 77 in the middle. So you have a kind of fractal-like pattern here if you remove all the images and keep only the patterns. Another interesting observation from this. So you'll notice that number 11, 22, 33, 44 are close to the center, and they fall on the vertical and horizontal axis. While number 55, 66, 88, 99 fall on diagonal axis, and they're further away from the center. And 77 here lies at the center. Further observation, if you link those numbers together, it forms a pattern. And this pattern is a fractal. If you would repeat it indefinitely, you would end up with a perfect fractal. Other observations. The distance between the numbers with double digits and the beginning of this whole sequence. For instance, between 1 and 55, there's 5 layers. Between 66 and 3, you have 6 layers. Between 33 and I think it's 6 here, you have 3 layers, and so forth. See? There's a kind of proportion, a sense of proportion developing among those numbers. You have the full diagram here. There's different ways to generate those foundational relationships. And I notice among the following, if you take all the numbers in a single column, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and extend them indefinitely, take any set of numbers, of 9 consecutive numbers, and you put them in a 3x3 matrix, the set of foundational relationship will apply. They will hold. Now, if you do that with a 2x2, I'm starting with 2 columns, and 2 times 2 equals 4. So I'm identifying blocks of 4 numbers. And these are the corresponding sigma values. Now you can pick up either on the left side or the right side and randomly any consecutive blocks of 9 numbers, put them in a 3x3 matrix, and all the foundational relationships will hold. And you can do that if you do a 3-column matrix, 3x3, just like the original set of numbers, but you repeat that with others. And again, pick up any block of 3x3 block here, and you'll notice that you get the same set of relationship. Here you notice that the sigma values are perfectly synchronized with their corresponding numbers, which wasn't the case in the previous tables. Like, that's another way to represent the same pattern. And here you can do the math and calculate. Notice though, by the way, that the resemblance with the three concentric circles here is purely coincidental, but it's happy coincidence. Now, if you work with other set of numbers, for instance, in this pattern, where you have 4 by 4, 16 blocks of 16s, the sigma numbers aren't synchronized, but take any block. And again, you can get those foundational relationships. Same applies to number 5 and number 6. And notice that number 6 have a synchrony between the index, the sigma numbers, sigma values, and the a 6 by 6 pattern of 6 by 6. Okay, so there's with number 3 and 6, the sigma numbers are synchronizing with the pattern on the left. Number 7, you see that they're not quite synchronized. And you'll notice, you're beginning to notice among the sigma values, some numbers are repeating geometrically in all sorts of ways. And that would be more evident here. For instance, you have 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 3, 3, 3, 3, 5, 5, 5, and 9, 9, 9, 9, and so forth. And I just gave 2 random examples where you can apply those foundational numbers. So you have it with all those numbers, but where it really becomes interesting and special is when you reach number 9, pattern based on 9 columns. Here you notice that the index, not the index, but the sigma values are 1 to 1 with the corresponding rows on the real numbers. So that's 1 from 1 to 81. You notice that when you're dealing with 9 columns, you can pick up any section vertically, diagonally, either in ascending or descending order. Any blocks of 3 by 3 values, or any row, and pick up those numbers, put them in 3 by 3 matrix, and you'll notice that the foundational relationships are always holding. Another interesting observation, sigma values are identical on each and every row. So here you have number 9, it's 9, 9, 9, 9. You have number 8, it's 8, 8, 8, 8, 8 across the board. Okay, that happens only with an initial block of 9 with 9 columns, and then you repeat that block continually. So if you put that in a simple table, you'll notice that the repeating numbers are moving diagonally across the board. Okay. With the previous table, you can build quite easily a different set of numbers with the foundational relationships that are always working. Okay, it's easy to build. And here, that's number 1 to number 81. Interestingly, each and every one of those blocks, in each and every one of them, the foundational relationships hold, but they also hold between those blocks. So between, if you take 161, you get 60, and you get 62. The average is 31. You can perform the math, and the foundational relationship will hold between those blocks. Same thing here. Same thing here. So that's an interesting development, because you have patterns embedded within patterns, and that's a fractal characteristic. So those mandalas do express the whole idea, but in a more artistic, let us say, and geometric way. So I have a few of those that I'll show you very quickly. Now let us consider the link between this and the Julia fractal. Julia fractal, there could be some complex formulas, but there is a simple formula by which you can extract this. It's a complex, a simple formula with which you can extract the Julia fractal. Z is a function of Z2 plus C. That's the highest mathematics that you'll see in my presentation, by the way. So for those of you who aren't mathematicians, that should be a bit reassuring. What you have here is this is a complex number, and this can be complex numbers, and they're plotted on a complex plane. And it's an iterative, so we perform multiple computation. Z will become equal to Z2 plus a constant C. And then that becomes the value of Z. And then you put you square it, add C, and you repeat the iteration continually. So when C equals 0.75 plus 11 times I, you get the following Julia fractal when you plot that on a complex plane. And you'll notice that this is a disconnected fractal. The parts of the fractal are not connected. On the other hand, with those values, C equal 0.74543 plus 11301 times I, well, you get a connected fractal. And what Mandelbrot discovered is when you plot the set of connected fractals, you get the Mandelbrot fractal. So the Mandelbrot fractal is an index of all the Julia fractals. And here what you have in this little animation is that there's a variation in the value of C, and it leads to connected and disconnected versions of the Julia fractals. And you see the dynamic. Sometimes they're connected, sometimes they're disconnected. So every time that C leads to a connected Julia fractal, you have a dot in the Mandelbrot fractal. That's how they generated the Mandelbrot fractal, by the way. So what I did from my iPhone, I got a Julia fractal close to those values, okay? And it is easy to map the foundational relationships on that fractal in certain ways, because there are structures in that fractal. And this is probably the most, I would say, symmetrical version of the fractal at those values. So see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The maths, you do the maths, works. You'll notice the horizontal lines, the vertical lines, and they're all perfectly fitting on that fractal. It's just showing those numbers, those structures without the fractal, okay? And then we'll come back to the fractal. Okay. So here you have the whole set without the fractal. Just to draw your attention, notice the arrows that you see here. They are inverted when you go through the center. So this arrow is the inverse of that one. This one, the inverse of that one, and the inverse of that one here. All those arrows on these quadrants have an inverse, okay, in terms of direction. And I'll show you how I picked up those directions. So here you have the fractal. How do I determine those arrows? Well, when you have a growing structure, the arrows follows that structure. So it goes with the growing structures scattered throughout the fractal. and it gives an interesting set of directions. At the beginning of this presentation, I was talking about the type of relationship that characterizes the relation, the foundational concepts of the Urantia book. So notice that there's a kind of iterative process linking those elements. Well, those arrows are indicative of that kind of iterative process, but from a visual perspective and taken from a fractal. You can see something similar a little bit more clearly if you subdivide the fractal in those parts. You'll notice that this section here is the exact inverse of that section, geometrically. For some strange reason, it's hard to see when you're not separating the fractal into the parts, but this section here is the exact opposite of that one. This section, the exact opposite of that one. Now think about, if I refer to the Urantia book, think about, for instance, actual, deified, and the exact opposite would be potential, undeified. Okay, so to complete that perhaps a little faster, if you would imagine extending the diagram that you have here to a billion, a number of a billion, instead of 99, go to a billion and pick up the sigma values of those values, you end up with this. And here, what you will notice is that the rows are inverted, columns are inverted, diagonals are inverted, and the number 369s will divide the whole pattern in 3 parts. And then you have fascinating patterns of inversions. And I'll show that in a few seconds. You have those numbers here that are inverted when they go through the centers, squarely inverted. So that will finish it. You have a set of inversions that are very similar to the inversions of the Julia fractal. This is all related to the foundational relationships that we find also in the Urantia book. So that sums it up at this point.
Okay, thank you. Pamela Chaddock asked, do prime numbers figure into your model?
Not directly, but there are certain relationships, well, with prime numbers. You notice that the foundational relationships are based on a 3x3 matrix, so number 1 to 9. 9 is a significant number here. There is a way to find a pattern among the prime numbers related to number 9. I don't remember the same way, but I think that you I don't remember the exact way to do it, but there's, after this presentation, I can show you that there is a relationship, a distant relationship, though, not a close one, but a relationship nonetheless.
A question from your external reviewer, Gaetan Charlan, is what is the relationship of fractals to the law of evolution in nature?
Well, there's many relationships. For instance, the population of species, the manner in which a population of species is stabilized is related to a fractal pattern. What they call morphogenesis, the evolution of shapes and living beings. There's something related to a fractal pattern here. If you look at the organs of living beings, they all have a fractal geometry. They all display fractal geometry. Take the brains, the lungs, the liver, the kidneys, And if you look at different living organisms, flowers or crystals or some vegetables, they all have the fractal geometry. So life seems to be associated with fractal geometry, but it goes further than that. The relationship is that when to generate a fractal, you have to iterate a formula, a very small, simple formula, but iterating this formula generates some fairly complex and sophisticated patterns. This seems to be a bit similar to the process of evolution, because in the process of evolution, you have some iterations. Species reproduce, and at each reproduction there's a kind of iteration, and through those iterations there are small variations appearing, and that's part of the process of evolution. So there's a link between fractals and evolution as a process.
Okay, thanks. I think Phil has a question.
Well, I'll make some comments here. I thought it was excellent presentation of the simultaneous generation of the 7 absolutes of infinity. I like the comment or the observation that meditation allows new thinking to emerge. If we could just quiet our mind and long enough to allow that. And the hypothetical static moment and plus self-will. So I have a question of where does personal choice fit in here with all this mathematics and geometry? We must be able to interject some freedom of choice. As recently somebody said, well, how could that be the case if God knows everything ahead of time? I said, well, you're saying that God can't give us choice.
Oh, okay, so this is just a mathematical analogy. But if you look at the mathematical pattern, number 5 would represent the I am and would represent the will of God, the universal Father. But if you put that on an individual dimension, that would represent personality, free choice, and the presence of the thought adjuster within that personality. Now, an individual may evolve along a spiritual dimension, a mental or Urantia dimension, or at the level of the soul, if you want to put it that way. And physically, there's physical evolution. I mean, your understanding of science and your mastery of the physical world is an evolving process. And those three layers are well involved. The kind of transition between the actual, what you reached so far, what you've achieved so far, the potential that you can achieve, and the transition between the potential and the actual, which is the center where growth takes place. So if you take that as a pattern or as a model, you can apply it to human beings, individual beings, to any personality, whether they have a physical body or spiritual body or whatever. You could apply that across the board. It's a kind of conceptual matrix. And the nice thing about this conceptual matrix, it seems to run parallel to some fractal processes.
Okay, thank you, Conrad. Gard has a question.
So I might have a little bit of an answer for you, Phil. We know in the Urantia book that personality is the supreme revelation of God to the universes. So if you look at the number 7, it seems to have significance in our revelation, the 7 absolutes, 7 levels of deity. If you divide 7 into 1, you get an infinite repeating number: 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7. 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7. The arrows indicate in the Enneagram conceptualization of personality, which I find to be very compelling, They indicate arrows of progress, directions in which one would go to develop one's personality type. And the arrows moving against represent, if you will, regression of personality development, personality under stress. So again, if you take that repeating pattern of 142857, 142857, and then you have the triangle of 369, you've got all of those numbers that Conrad was referring to, and you have a very interesting pattern which relates to the whole concept of personality. It also relates to the concept of agency, which you were talking about earlier. So we can make choices for progression. We know that the divine plan in paper 7 is a plan of progression. We can make choices for progression using these arrows, which again, thousands and I would say tens of thousands of people around the planet who have used this pattern, who understand Enneagram work, have discovered leads to the development of the soul and the growth of our identity. So that's just a little bit of an answer. And an observation, Mandelbrot, before he died, was asked to go to Wall Street to provide, if you will, some insight as to how fractal understanding might be applied to the crash of 2009. He provided, if you will, some patterned understandings which were rejected by Wall Street because it would reduce their compensation. Enough said.
Garrett, I'll show you something that will reinforce what you just said. In the last part of my presentation, I had that diagram. And you see number 1, 2, 4 inversed here, 1, 2, 4, and number 5, 7, 8, 5, 7, 8.
Mhm.
So these are the sequence of the Enneagram.
Yeah.
It's also what you get when we take 1 divided by 7. And also, quite interestingly, those numbers, if you take 1, 2, 4, then go to 8, then 7, then 5, and come back to 1, 2, 4. It's a cycling number.
Yep.
And if you take the Pascal triangle and you add the rows of the Pascal triangles and get the sigma values of those rows, you get those repeating numbers.
Yep. I do believe, again, personality being the core gift of the universe to each of us, that there is pattern in personality. Not only the Enneagram, but also Myers-Briggs. And so much of what we see on page 1222 in the Urantia book, it says personality follows pattern. And so there's numerical sequencing associated with those patterns. So bravo, Conrad. Thank you for your presentation.
Thanks, Gard. I have a question. And I'm, and please correct me because I am probably wrong, but I'm calling back over 20 years when I had to take a computer graphics class to understand how to actually build models of molecular interaction models for proteins and protein assembly. And but I remember the Julia set particularly that you talked about in your talk. And but I also remember the Fatou set, which is sort of the antithesis to a degree of the Julia set. And the thing that I remember, and this is where you need to correct me if I am wrong, is that the Julia set, the Fatou set, the dynamics of it are very ordered. It's a very ordered sort of thing. While the Julia set is more sensitive and dependent on initial conditions and very quickly. And so it lends itself to chaos. In other words, toward make more chaotic in my case, growth, okay, growth of a crystal. So my question is that you invoke the Julia set, but it just seems to me that when we look at like the diagram that Gard just offered us, and the things that we know about the pattern that the Father has set for us and the organization of the universe, those are very ordered to me. You know, he has a very, you know, and he has people taking care of things and to make sure that they stay ordered and that we don't descend into chaos in particularly the physical world. Okay, I'm talking about cosmologically. That there is an order out there that we see. So when and your diagrams that you show appear to be more ordered, and so they seem to fit more the Fatou set of the way fractals are done than the Julia set. So could you correct me about my, I think I must have a misconception. So would you correct me?
Well, the Julia sets look disordered depending on the value of C, especially when C is a complex number and you map it on a complex plane. Sometimes you have a kind of cloud of, and it looks scattered. And when, if you take the Mandelbrot fractal, and there's two major parts of the Mandelbrot fractal, and the middle part is what we call the seahorse section.
Mm-hmm.
And if you click there and get the each point of the Mandelbrot fractal is defined by a Julia fractal, a connected Julia fractal, and it is in this region that the Julia fractals are the most let us say symmetrical, most orderly, if I could put it that way. And if you pick it up from there, you get an orderly version of the Julia fractal. But the fact that the Julia fractal is generated, the Mandelbrot fractal is generated by the Julia fractal, because it's an index of Julia fractals for all intents and purposes, is indicative of something quite fascinating. Because when you zoom into the Mandelbrot fractal, you see a whole bunch of very orderly patterns. And this pattern of a star with eight branches repeats continually when you zoom enough in the Julia in the Mandelbrot fractals. You will see the Julia fractals structured within the Mandelbrot fractals. And the pattern that I showed is also visible, and it's recursive. It reappears continually in the Mandelbrot fractals. So there's something mysterious there. I don't know, but it's not just a random occurrence. There's something there that is beyond our understanding. Those fractals, by the way, are unlimited. They have a limited shape, but you can zoom indefinitely into those fractals. So it reminds me that the statement that on Paradise, any surface may become absolute. On a fractal, take any surface of a fractal, and you can zoom and blow it up, and take any small portion of it and can zoom and blow it up. And you have sometimes some repeating structures, not always. Sometimes the structure will gradually change. Fascinating stuff.
Yes.
At the end of the presentation, I have a link pointing to a video that zooms to the fractal during 13 minutes. And if you would compare all the zooming, it would be the equivalent of taking a proton and expanding it zillion times the size of the known universe.
Okay.
Quite amazing.
Phil had his hand up. So Phil, what would you like to ask?
Well, I just wanted to make a couple of more comments. The use of the complex plane of numbers, which extends the real numbers, is interesting. And, as you were talking about your patterns, I thought well, what happens if you go to 3 dimensions instead of 2?
Yeah.
You know, instead of 9, it's now 27. It also seems that we know more about the patterns than we know about the philosophical interpretations.
Yeah. Yeah. Just out of curiosity, there's another set of numbers known as the quaternion. You're probably
Yeah,
much more aware of that than I am.
Yeah,
Quaternions, and there's some interesting similarities of reversal with those numbers. I just read about that, and I think there's a noctanian or something like that, another set as well.
that's about as far as it goes. Because we keep losing properties as we add to the algebra to make it closed. The quaternions, you need 4 instead of just 2 numbers. Like in the complex numbers, you get 2 real numbers. The quaternions, you have 4 of them, and then you go to 8, and then no one has figured out how to go any further than that.
Yeah. The philosophical interpretations from a mathematical perspective would be hard to get, but if you make a parallel with some real life examples, so just doing a matrix, let us say values, meanings, and facts on, let us say, one side, and actual emerging potential, and then you can plug all sorts of themes on that matrix, and you can get some fascinating developments, and all sorts of from a philosophical standpoint, as well as from even a spiritual standpoint. Or I've been teaching policy analysts, and I took that model once just as a test, and threw it at a bunch of advanced policy analysts, and they found it very interesting. They asked, where is it coming from? Which I didn't mention, but still.
Okay, I have another question from Marvin. I'm assuming Garwin, but it just says Marvin, a question for Marvin. Do your findings relate to Fibonacci's ratios or Fibonacci numbers? Right.
I can show you something about that, though.
Okay.
Here you have the Fibonacci numbers mapped on that pattern, and you notice that it's a very, very equal spirals. So it seems to combine well with the Fibonacci numbers, but we know that with the Fibonacci numbers, you have the ratio it converges toward what we call the golden number, which is used in arts and which has special mathematical properties. So what I thought was, if you take all the even multiples of 9, okay, which are listed here up from 0 to 360, and you get the sine or the cosine of those numbers, okay, you end up and multiply by 2, you end up with either the golden number or the golden section. Now, what's interesting, take the first set of numbers, put them in a 3x3 matrix, and the foundational relationships still hold. Same thing with the second set of numbers, which is quite amazing to me. So it seems to indicate that there's some sort of relationship between that pattern and the Fibonacci numbers, which would warrant some further exploration.
David Henry wanted to know if you've applied any of this to crop circles. I thought that was a really interesting talk, because we've all seen them, and they all look like, some sort of form of crop circle. But we also know that these 2 guys in England do them. So
that's where they have a lot of them. But it would be interesting to compare that with some of those crop circles and see if there's some kinds of sort of geometrical similarities or relationships. I find that those crop circles are extraordinarily aesthetic. They're
beautiful
nice
to look at.
Oh,
I agree. I agree.
It would be an interesting study.
Yeah, right. That would be fun. Okay, Phil's got another comment.
It seems like our decimal system with 9 digits has some significance there because there are all those triples, and then you stack them up and you've got 9 and the universal father in the middle. So there's something going on there that seems like it's worth looking into. Although if we used a different decimal, instead of decimals, we used 12 or something, I suppose it wouldn't work out the same way. But it still raises some questions about the patterns.
Yep.
Okay. Would you like to make any sort of final statement, Conrad?
Well, the manner in which I went through this was through contemplative observation. Started with the first set of 9 numbers, put myself in a contemplative state of mind, and then it all develops up to the end of this presentation. And that's an approach that I would encourage everyone to practice, looking at the world with new eyes, seeing things as if we were seeing them for the first time. It's a source, it's a thrill, and it's a fascinating source of discovery.
Thank you, Conrad. Excellent. And I think you've got 3 people that are right there with you on this right now.